What is up, y'all? You are here with us on this beautiful Christmas Eve, and you are listening to, absorbing the thought excretions that are coming from myself. I am gratis beer sometime in the future, and I'm joined by my wonderful co-host. He's taken the gig economy and turning it into a big sig economy, the big Signorelli himself.
Signorelli, Dirk Sigler himself.
Siggy Stardust.
Siggy
Siggy
Stardust.
Pop. We're running out of Siggies.
Yeah.
If anyone has any suggestions, drop them in the comments. And how we feeling today? What are we talking about?
Talking about the difficulties of regression, pretty much, right? We're getting into more of the interpretation of dreams. Again, most of the stuff that's being referenced, like throughout these chapters that we've been going over, have to deal with chapter 7 in interpretation of dreams. For instance, like the main elements of that chapter go over not only like regression, but it goes over the forgetting of dreams, like we talked about in the last chapter in forgetting, and the process of censorship and how censorship is not resistance. The way that resistance was discussed in the first seminar, resistance to transference, right? And in this one, the question of regression and its difficulties is addressed into them. So pretty much regression for Freud, and I want to like emphasize that this is a different notion of regression to how it's kind of used and appropriated in um, other forms of psychoanalysis, like object relations. Like it has to do with like going back to certain like infantile identifications and objects. Like the emphasis in object relations is always a relationship between the child and the mother, right? So it's like, oh, you're regressing back to things, um, in this analytic session or in your dreams where you desire something that's like your mother's breast, but you are kind of, biting your fingernails. And as a kid, you used to like suck on your thumb, right? These are
Right.
things that you did, yeah. Or in the sort of neo-Freudian is or classical Freudian example, regression is going back to a libidinal stage and a sort of cathexing in it and kind of repeating that sort of infantile behavior. It's kind of like, for lack of a better term, you're going back to being a man child, pretty much. You're being a man
Right.
child, like you're
And
going back to being a child.
regression is one of those psychoanalytic terms that entered into common parlance.
Right.
People use regression in the context of, oh, when I go back to my parents' house, for example, when I'm home, I regress.
Right, right. Or
It's
it's
like I
like,
become a child again. I start snacking or asking my parents to make a sandwich for me, or just relying on them in a way that I have learned to wean myself off of into adulthood.
right.
Ideally, not everyone has, but it's like it's actually not that far from the kind of regression that you're describing in the object relations definition
Right.
of it. Wouldn't
Yeah.
you say it kind of matches up? Whereas,
In like a crude
yeah,
way, like the
in a crude
mainstream
way,
way.
yeah.
Yeah. Right. A very vulgar way of like explaining it. Overgeneralization.
So
Uh,
in this chapter, though, I'm wondering, with regression, is Vala Brega misreading something in a way that is, to Lacan, obviously wrong? Are we dealing with a terminological mistake, or is it that regression of the kind that we just described does in some sense play into the structure, the dynamic of the dream, but Valabrega, according to Lacan, is misinterpreting its role And in fact, Lacan prefers this word regredient,
Right, regredient.
regression, I think,
Yeah,
to disambiguate the kind of
exactly.
regression of the dream from the libidinal sort of regression that you were describing. Or
I think that's right. And for different reasons, because I think um like for instance, most of the sort of zeitgeist of psychoanalysis during that time, we're in sort of these like crude understanding of Freud, and even like the dominant sort of frame of psychoanalysis, which is like a sort of object relations. Like again, with regredient, there is like a going backwards, but it has nothing to do with like libidinal stages. What Freud emphasizes in sort of like these like processes of stimulation and energy is that there is a process in the waking life which a sort of sense of excitation or processing of energy flows through in our day-to-day life. But some of the stuff that I guess doesn't get sort of discharged or satisfied by the pleasure principle. Let's say, at least from the way I'm reading it, like because of the reality principle or whatever, some of the stuff ends up taking place in the dream life, right? To sort of work through. So in a sense, there is this backwards process of the energy that should have went through a different through that strict direction by sort of Freud's understanding is counterintuitive and goes backwards and tries to work itself out through a dream.
interesting. So
Yeah,
would you say they build up like pustules of undischarged energy in a sense that the dream attempts to pop, and
right.
therefore manage the energy in a way that the waking processes were
Right.
unsuccessful at doing?
And I think like I'm gonna probably repeat and elaborate this as we go through the text. I think because we're using Freud's terminology and we're used to the Lacanian terminology, first off, it seems a little weird and hard to kind of like break through. It's kind of a little discombobulating. But if we replace a lot of these terms with like energy, entropy, or like stimuli with sort of desire, then we see how desire tries to work itself out through the dream, right? If we replace wish fulfillment, which Freud uses in Beyond, or not Beyond, in interpretation of dreams, with desire, then we see how desire kind of manifests itself in the sort of the dream. Because what look chapter 7 starts off with is a dream that is referenced in Seminar 11, with the father having a dream and the child wakes him up as he's sleeping in the dream and says, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" And he's lit up, and he wakes up and he goes to the other room just to see that his son, who I think had passed away or is sick and is like supposed to deem terminal, is asleep. He's got candles lit around him, and the old man who's watching him is passed out. And there's a sort of question if whether or not the father has some guilt, in the sense that like he feels like he didn't do enough to kind of take care of the child or look after it, and also place the burden on the old man for not being a good guardian and unfit for the duty, and also felt guilty that he fell asleep when he should have been watching his son while he was sick.
Can can we put a pin in that just for a second? Because when you were talking about desire there, it reminded me of something the homie Becker said about the previous chapter we read, the video I was watching recently, which was very good. Censorship is not resistance. He says that he thinks Lacan is almost adhering too closely to the letter of Freud's work in trying to pretty much adapt his ideas, his method of theorizing to the lexicon that Freud is using, the different schemata that Freud's relying on, maybe even excessively, because it's like one thing you learn from reading the, what is it called, the function field, the Rome lecture,
Right.
is that in that lecture, surprisingly, Lacan does use jouissance. He talks about the signifier. I'm pretty sure he talks about desire as
Right.
well. But in these lectures, he's not really using signifier. He's definitely not used. I think he might have used jouissance once or twice. I feel like that word
Yeah.
popped up, but it seems like he's deliberately avoiding relying in this mouthwash fashion on his own ideas so that they, when he does introduce desire, they're that much more textured.
Yes, and yeah, and they're in a certain context. I think right here it's like he's wanting to give the best reading of Freud, so then he could show like what his contribution to the return of Freud is. Because even in seminar one, even though we're going over the Freud's papers on technique, of course, there's not really a lot of like these terminology of like, stimuli and stuff like that. And it's due to the fact that like we're mainly talking about transference, the dynamics of transference resistance, transference love, narcissism. So very tangible, very easy to read, very scientific in their own regard, but it's nothing along these lines in which we have the scientific terminology dealing with energy, entropy, certain schemata, and even getting into like the realm of neurology, right? And it seems that he's really adhering to a close reading of these texts, line item by line item.
And I want to pick up the thread of what you're saying with the father, don't you see I'm burning dream, but just to get your thoughts on one more aspect of this. I've noticed this pattern of him near the end of these lectures introducing his own terminology. And I don't
Right.
know if Freud used the term subject all that often. You would know better than I would.
I have to pay attention more, but yeah, I wouldn't really off the top of my head say that if he does use it, it's like every now and then. It's not like as like it doesn't really thread a lot of his understanding of like what we're talking about. He'll talk about
Right.
psychic process, psychic apparatus, and of course in interpretation of dreams he uses that psychological or like the ego, but yeah, like or organism, but like nothing like on the lines of like what we're talking about, the subject for Lacan, right?
It's just very interesting that he will say things like Freud is concerned with the symbolic first and foremost.
Right.
He's attributing his own ideas to Freud's systems and almost like putting his own words in Freud's mouth
Yeah.
in a way that I think is really interesting. But it's a testament to the meticulousness of his own attempts to theorize and argue in a way that would work to substantialize his own ideas, because a lot of thinkers, a lot of philosophers, they're like, all right, you got your desiring machines, you
Yeah.
got your Dasein, you got your this, you got your that. And, depending on how you feel about any of those philosophers, Heidegger, Deleuze, they all do a pretty damn good job of like justifying the ideas. But I like how what and Lacan isn't a philosopher, he's an anti-philosopher supposedly, but the way that in which he situates his own ideas within this
Right.
larger field and network of Freudian theories
Right.
is admirable to me, because he wants, I mean, and let's be honest, Lacan was extremely arrogant
Right. Oh
to,
yeah.
to, to an extreme, and he was definitely very confident in his own ideas, but And I think these seminars are really important to read because you see, but these are the anti-mouthwash seminars that must be read in order for a Lacanian to avoid just slipping into a non-reflective, reflexive usage of these terms.
A systematician.
Anyway. Yeah.
You know, being another. But it's funny that you brought up the arrogance of Lacan, because I was reading the first chapter of Seminar 10, which is the anxiety one, and he just like points out like he openly expresses the arrogance because he's talking about this notion of anxiety is nothing new. We look at, you know, our wonderful existentialist school of thought, and we have Kierkegaard, who was the forefront of it. A couple other names that he talks about. Then we have, you know, Monsieur Sartre, Heidegger, and Gabriel Marcel, and the last person foremost to talk about it is yours truly, Jacques Lacan.
Dr. Lacan, right? I was listening to the Danny Nobis conversation with Tut.
Oh, it's a good one. That's a good
really
one.
Really interesting tidbits about Lacan's life, but apparently he insisted on people calling him Dr. Lacan, which is sort of the opposite of the almost compulsory modesty that exists among academics today, where it's like they're not actually modest at all, but it's kind of like, yeah, call me Jeff. No, you don't have to call me professor, doctor. There's some disavowal there, but no, Lacan went the other direction. He's like, no, I'm Dr. Lacan. I'm Dr. Jacques Lacan.
Right. And then like how, like, you know, he wanted to dress like a bourgeois, like as like the age of 17 or something like that. And then like just like overall the fact that like he would be that like hipster. He is a hipster.
He would have been an insufferable hipster. Yeah, you're totally right. He was absolutely a hipster. Yeah, and then you see how he dresses later in life. He's wearing like the puffy shirt from Seinfeld in the famous lecture that he gives that was recorded.
Yeah, this shit's good.
Anyway,
So who is the subject then? As the chapter starts off with a genius question, who is the subject? And he wants to point out that, you know, again, like we talked about prior to the recording, that it's not like the subject is not this noun, it's not this schema that we could just be in our little chalkboard or whiteboard and be like Leclerc and just try to schematize it and be like, the subject's this. It's like, no, right? We should avoid schematizing it, but for possible, you know, lest we become like systematized and, you know, try to, you know, have a sort of location for it. And I think this is exactly what the whole thing about the dream work and Freud's notion of like a psychic apparatus, that it's not local. Like Freud is not locating the dream inside the sleeper. That's the thing. It's like, yes, the dreams could obviously occur when the person's sleeping, but they don't necessarily exist inside, you know, the person's brain, even if there's brain activity, certain, what is it like? What is it when you're asleep? You get what, like a theta waves or whatever. You can't locate it in that, right? It's not located in the eye movement or REM, but there is a correlation between the dream work and the sleeper, right? And the sort of wish to sleep or drive to sleep, right? And the dream is like the sort of excess that comes with the drive, right? Because it's the difference between an instinct to sleep and a drive to sleep. And we know this because of insomnia, where people just can't sleep, right? We don't have, I mean, maybe somebody could comment on here and be like, oh, actually, like some zoologist, but not really any animals that have insomnia, right?
Never thought about it before. Yeah, that's never a question I've asked myself.
Right.
Owls? I don't know.
Well, yeah, we have nocturnal, but they do sleep in the day. Bats, yeah. But like, you know, any animals with insomnia or anything like that. So like, it's like an instinct, like, you know, it's like ingrained in the, but like for us, right, we're the only ones that diagnose ourselves with insomnia or stay up late or have this drive to stay up late because we want to watch, like, you know, back in the day when Adult Swim was like very popular and anime Saturdays, like we would fucking lose sleep on that just so we could watch
Oh
all the
yeah.
anime because Crunchyroll wasn't a thing back in the day. So
All
drive
you
to sleep,
kids
yeah, the drive
should
to
know
watch
that.
anime is a better thing.
So anime explains the subject, essentially, the drive to watch anime.
Exactly.
Sublimation that is
Yeah.
Naruto. Um, there's a lot going on in this chapter because I think it's you can lose sight of the importance of the question of who is the subject throughout this lecture because it does get very technical and
Right.
we do explore the insufficiencies of Freud's schemata, what Vala Brega perceives as certain insufficiencies, in a way that the location of the subject or the non-localizability, if that's a word, of the
Right.
subject um, kind of falls by the wayside. I think Vala Brega, I wouldn't say derails the lecture because there's a lot. His explorations of these ideas do bear fruit, and he is no one's a peer of Lacan exactly, but he does take Lacan to task on a few different points. But really, at the heart of it, I feel is this cited footnote from Freud where he talks about wish fulfillment. This
Right.
again, this is an idea that has entered the not the zeitgeist necessarily, but among certain urbane individuals, the notion that a dream is a form of wish fulfillment is maybe not taken as gospel, but a common idea. However, what isn't so common is the thought that the nightmare, dreams that cause anxiety,
Right.
are also expressions of wish fulfillment in some sense. But
Right.
before we get off on that, I want to take it back to the subject here. And I think this citation is very important in as much as Lacan puts it, we have a decentering of the subject to which Freud alludes, in that the, like you were just saying, the dream, it isn't your property.
Right.
It's homologous to a commodity, as
Yeah.
Zizek establishes, but it isn't a commodity. It isn't something you own or
Yeah.
possess.
Yeah.
In a sense, you could say, rather, it possesses you, if we want to be
For real.
kind of
Yeah.
like provocative. But I think what he's getting at here is the fact that one experiences an anxiety wish as a the opposite, as betokening the opposite of desire, something that you want to keep as far from consciousness as possible,
Exactly.
speaks to the split subjectivity at
Yeah.
work as it's exemplified in the dream, something that's obfuscated in waking life.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to say, and the first thing is that um, Derek Hook brings us up in his lectures on dream theory, talking about the notion of wish fulfillment, right? Because and I could even mention my second thing. It's like who is being fulfilled? Whose wish is it? Because it's not at the level of the ego, right? And if we switch the term wish fulfillment to desire, then whose desire is it? The other's discourse, right? But who is the other, right? And the subject that's being barred by that from out, because the question is who is the subject? So we're using, this is Lacan, like we mentioned, prior to the terms that are now mouthwashed by the mainstream. But one thing that Derek Hook brings up in kind of justifying Freud's notion of the wish fulfillment is he brings up a scenario of what if somebody comes in and be like, but Derek, I had a dream and I did not wish it. I had a dream that my sister died and I went to her funeral and I was very sad. And he's like, well, then Freud would be like, oh, so tell me about the dream. Well, I was there. I was standing right there at the funeral. Everybody came to see my sister, who passed away. And then I saw a friend of mine that I hadn't seen since I was a kid. And oh, so the Freud would be like, tell me about the friend. And then you'd start associating, saying like how much like you miss them, like what you associate with them. And it's the sort of weird way in which the dream forms the wish fulfillment in the sort of formation and logic using sort of latent content and other random things that don't even make sense, right? That's the main thing. But it's just like, it's not to say that like you, the ego desire, or not even you, but like you're not the ego, but like the ego desiring it, but it's rather like a sort of discourse of other that formulates that. And through the circuit of desire, right, or wish fulfillment, to be Freudian about it, is that it manifests in sort of this way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the dream is like this little snow globe version of what happens, not happens, but of the relation between consciousness and the unconscious in waking life as well. It's not as if in the dream something occurs that is qualitatively different. I could be wrong about this, but qualitatively different from waking life in the sense that you are transformed into another being. No, it's that the split, the cut that is subjectivity is set in relief in a way in the form of the microcosmic world encompassed by the dream in a way that isn't obvious, not just isn't obvious, can't be apprehended as such in waking life. So a lot of this has to do with, and now I feel like I'm going out on a limb here, but the relationship between consciousness and perception, which is something that he and Vala Brega are going to debate on.
Right.
And it's like perception is not consciousness. And the psyche is not consciousness.
Right. And I think like insofar as like consciousness being the sort of substance or noun or thing that, everybody in the intelligentsia so far has been throwing this term around, right? Ever since Descartes and the whole mind-body dualism that everybody wants to equate consciousness as if it is the noun or identity of like mind, right? A thing that contains things, right? And I think that's pretty much what Lacan wants to get rid of, because, and that's why, like I pointed out in I think like a couple of seminars or lectures that we recorded about, like, isn't it interesting how in is it chapter 4 or 5 where he calls it the phenomenon of consciousness rather than a materialist definition of consciousness. It's a materialist definition on the phenomenon of consciousness.
Materialist definition, yeah, exactly, yeah. On the phenomenon of consciousness. How can we, okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves and look at the schema too soon, but what can we say about
this structure? I think like for the most part, this schemata that Freud is getting at is that, like, again, there's these processes like that happen on the level of what we call perception and consciousness. And then we have another process that happens on the mnemic, right? Is that how you pronounce it? Like level, which I think only really, if I understand correctly, really works or manifests itself on the dream level. And it's not to say that certain contents from the perception consciousness or the primary process, which we would say happens on the waking daylight, doesn't occur then. But things that you wouldn't remember like right away happen on that level of the mnemonic or like the secondary process, if I'm using my terms correctly. And like I mentioned prior to the recording, it's like yeah, a cringe memory usually will come up when you're like not doing anything, where you're lost in the trance because you're like um you know I don't know, doing the dishes, or maybe like you're working on your car or something like that, or you're driving and you get kind of lost in like a sort of like absorbed in it. Then when you're not consciously uh engaged with things, that they come up. But in the dream life, there's like there's no restriction, right? The dreams just take a life on their own. It's like you said, they control us. So when we're asleep, dreams do whatever the hell they want. Or like if you notice, when we're in like this hypnotic state, or like we're dazed, or like even in class, like the um picture perfect like kid who's bored in school and just daydreams, because they're so bored or interested with what's going on, that they get lost in their own imagination and they start formulating fantasies. We can see this happen in the transference, where due to the enigmatic desire keyword, it's exacerbated because your desire is the desire of the other, which is the analyst, who's the subject supposed to know. That's the transference, that all these different memories and stuff come up just as they would in the dream process. And I think this is what is happening in the mnemic aspect versus the perceptual, because he'll later talk about how the ego is the sort of direction and buffer zone, or the compass for the psi system, that the psi system is the ego, right? And it creates the direction, the pathway for all these stimuli. But some things it just can't, right? It doesn't want to encounter the unconscious or that other part of memory.
There are a lot of moving parts here, and it's hard to manage all of them, because when we're looking at this schema and trying to relate it to the subject and the dream, I think it's important to bear in mind that we're still caught up in the question of, as you mentioned before, what the materialist definition of consciousness really is. My question for you is, how does, and you already, I think in some fashion, you've already answered this question, but how does the dream help us, by providing a model, help us understand consciousness as it is for Lacan? And can we relate it to this?
Right.
Schema?
So if we remember in seminar 1, he shows this model in like the first page in or second page of the topic of the imaginary section. And then he creates the new model, the optical schema. And so he actually quotes a section in the interpretation of dreams that kind of elaborates on this sort of schema that we're going over. And I want to try to find it, but Freud pretty much wants to talk about, because he has like sort of speculations of like not only the dream, where the dream is, and like if it could be located. And what he wants to say is that if we look at a sort of telescope, or like the part of like how old cameras work, we shouldn't say that the image itself is located within the mirror and the lens, right? You can't locate it in there. But yet, how is it that in operating on a camera, that it's able to capture such an image, right? We'll never know, right? About like, if we end up getting lost in this sort of like what came first, the chicken or the egg type thing, to kind of, keep it like stupid simple. But for this materialist definition, what these schemas and the notion of the camera, the mirror lens, and all these sorts of metaphors that are being used allow us to do is sort of bringing objectification of what seems to be a purely personal and private phenomenon. That's the main thing that I kind of want to at least like. If does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It's so easy to lose the thread of his style of argumentation because you're looking for, and this is his neologism, the entified, entity version, the making into a thing of the subject, because we're habituated to look for things, to look for objects. So I think every maneuver that he does when making these arguments, every one of them helps to outline not, again, the location of the subject, but a kind of topology, a landscape, a sort of striated network that exists, which will help us to decenter the subject, to understand that the question, who is the subject, is of primary importance, but the question, well, where exactly is the subject in all of this, is what I think he wants to dispel as having any kind of meaning to it. If we can remove that question from the roster of commonly, posed queries in philosophy, then we can get at what consciousness is for Freud, at least.
Right.
And any of that makes sense. I don't know.
It does. And to kind of elaborate on it, so if you look at like the question of like what is psychoanalysis and like what it like its purpose in like the beginning of seminar 1, that like the question, can it be a science? But for Freud, it's a science of a particular truth and the truth of the subject. Or no, our concern for like who is the subject is not to be like, the subject is this, but rather to sort of identify the truth of the subject. And to be Hegelian about it, the more we know about the subject, the more we have a sort of position of absolute knowing, but it's only done retroactively and through the process of failures that we take into account, right? It's not about like this sort of absolute knowledge or like to know something and locate it, but rather the sort of accumulation of certain instances of knowing and getting closer and failing and starting back symbolically from the same position we were, but we gain a new perspective and understanding that allows us to repeat again. And I think that's what is at task with the subject, that the subject is not a thing, it is a process, but a process of constant knowing, of retracing back. And to tie that in with the dreams, this is what the dreams allow us to do because they have a certain history to them with memory, right? And if you bring it into interpretation, the closer to you get to knowing the subject through the unconscious.
It's sort of like this cutting of figure eights.
Yeah, the Mobius. It's the Mobius.
That's right.
The Mobius strip, which Zizek likes to talk about,
We're always back at the Mobius strip. So let's take it to, well, we could take it in many different directions. We could talk about the topic of regression. Actually, wait, something that I had a hard time understanding was, well, Vala Brega's own, not objection to, but his own confusion regarding this schema and what he says about it being open on both sides. My understanding of it is that like we have the preconscious. It's thanks to the preconscious that we're able to maintain an ego, but it's like the ego, in as much as it exercises a protective function, keeps us whole. Not really, but at least maintains
Right.
the imaginary wholeness that we sort of carry with us through the day. It is two-pronged in its defensive role there, because it needs to guard against excitations coming from the external world. And in order to do that, as I understand it, it's like when he talks about hallucinations, I don't think he doesn't mean Wolfman type hallucinations. He means like literally our experience of reality, I think, in being like
He does.
hallucination. That's
Yeah.
like, that is, which with we measure the immediate continuous flux of what's coming through
Right.
against, but also there
Like
is
reality
the
testing.
reality testing, and then there's the other side to the, again, protective apparatus of the ego, and that it needs to also guard against sudden intrusions, the bubbling up of ideas that are coming, well, not ideas, but what would you call them, like non-discharged memories, evocations that are coming from the unconscious, from the opposite direction. Does that have something to do with the opening? And what is Vala Brega's, the opening on both sides? And what's Vala Brega's beef with this schema exactly? That's a whopper of a question.
Right. Yeah.
Do with that what you will, is what I'm saying.
I think you're on the money. It seems like, because this is fucking hard as hell. But no, when looking at like what Vala Brega is saying, I think really he's not understanding the fact, at least for like with Lacan, he wants to say that this, like, yeah, like the ego does regulate sort of excitation from internal and externally, right? And that's why he says he's building up to say that this psi system, this internal structure that regulates stimuli, is the ego, and it also is going to be able to calculate and interpret and process stimuli from the outer world, Umwelt, right? But there is this sort of decentering of it because of the unconscious. But I don't know if I really have anything to say about like how it's the pre-conscious that allows it to exist, or like anything to elaborate on that.
That I think that was mistaken. It's not the pre-conscious that allows that, but that's not true. What I said, I know that though the pre-conscious plays an important role in
right. It does,
the censorship, but the censorship is constitutive of the ego, I would say, in many ways.
And in the super ego as well,
which, right, he doesn't actually mention here, which is interesting. Well, but we talked about it in the chapter.
We talk about it, and Brian Becker in his video essay and mentions it as well, because that is also part of because right now, like, he's only mentioning the ego like in this chapter, or like which is another interesting thing too, when we talk about how like deep in like these like scientific writings, he talks about consciousness as a buffer zone, and he'll lead to the end of this chapter to mention the ego being the psi apparatus. But he never breaks down to the function of how the ego operates, in which he mentions in the last seminar 1, about the fluctuation between ego ideal and ideal ego, and the function of the superego as such, within that, in this sort of elaborate process. So it's like we're having to fill in the blanks. I think the superego does have something to do with sort of censoring a lot of this stuff, in regards to not only the free association and analysis, but also even in maybe the dream process, and in regulating excitation, right? Especially if we're dealing with like what is the outer world, right? Or what is the Umwelt, right? But like not some weird like quasi, like we're in nature and we're just like this what is noble savage. No, we live in a fucking capitalist society. But even then, like Freud was living in a Victorian society, so living in customs, norms, and a culture that has rules and regulations and prohibitions. So having to regulate all these excitations that come with that, and also, you know, your own internal excitations that you have to deal with, these choices, putting it into language pretty much like, oh, I shouldn't do this, I should do that, right? It's being regulated by the superego, right? But also how it positions your ego ideal, since it's all about symbolic identification.
Yeah. Can we refine what you're saying, and just by trying to place these concepts within the field of Lacan's early examinations of central Freudian notions? In that, I think, well, one, I want to say about the superego, it doesn't seem to me that at this stage in Lacan's thinking, the superego is the superego that enjoins enjoyment.
Right. I would say it's the superego of
Freud. It's much more like the moralistic.
It's yes, and that's why it has to deal with
terrorizing kind of superego, but one that enforces certain social norms, but not enjoyment.
Right. But it still would, like, either if it's an enjoyment or of the moralistic, like, categorical imperative that Freud advocated for, it still has this ability to sort of drive us towards ego ideal, right? And how it's like sort of symbolic.
Right. So structurally, it's very similar to the kind of superego that he's going to talk about in Seminar 20, but what it tells you to do is very different.
But either way, it still takes from the excessive drive, or like id, as we would say from Freud. And that's why superego has a sort of excess, right? Excess excitation, we could even say. So that's like some of the speculations I kind of have, which, you know, it makes it really hard to understand the relationship between this conscious perception and even how ego has to evolve when we're just in this pure, like, weird, like, anatomical scientific terminology. So like filling in the gaps, it makes a lot more sense when we kind of like add in these terms that we're all used to in psychoanalysis, right? Because psychoanalysis, now when we're not talking about psi, phi, omega, we're not talking about the neuron, we're not talking about this, we're talking about shit that we're used to seeing, like the unconscious, superego, id, or desires to desire the other, you know, all these terms. But we have to understand the buildup of it, right?
Yeah, as we were saying before, to we have to understand it archaeologically too.
Yeah, because Freud struggled in a time where the scientific, like, you know, zeitgeist, like, you know, of the modern era, but like even when he didn't want to be, like, you know, a schematic and trying to create sort of like schemas that become dogmatic, he was still trying to like grapple with creating something new and also appealing to the scientific discourse,
right?
And also overcoming it.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about before with some friends of ours when we were talking about consciousness in some of those voice notes. That's what I was saying. It's like he wanted to create an what does Lacan call it? Anatomophysicist, organicist system that's just a really pretentious way of saying something, that a system that would easily plug into the science of the time or interlock nicely, I think, with other scientific logics that were prevalent at the time. That's what it seems like Freud was trying to do. Now, let's be honest. People who are interested in psychoanalysis, Freud, Lacan, nobody wants to study this shit. They want to get to the motherfucker part.
Yeah.
That's the interesting stuff. The Oedipus stuff.
Yeah, they want to get to Oedipus, or they
the seedy, this is pornographic type, the theater, the Oedipal theater that is so maligned by D&G.
Right.
But this stuff is important.
Yeah. Everybody wants to be like, oh, this is totally me. I've always wanted just to love my mother. Like,
and And I hate my dad. Hey, I hate you, Dad. Suck. I wish you were dead. But then you look at one of these schemes and it's like most people are going to check out here.
Yeah, just like, all right.
At this point,
I'm just gonna go watch School of Life.
Yeah. Freud teaches us that we might try very hard at doing something and never be rewarded, but that's okay. Every School of Life video ends on that note. But that's okay. You're okay. Everything's okay. Life is disappointing. Oh well. Anyway, shout out to Alain de Botton or whatever his name is. I know that he got all of his money from the Rothschilds, but you didn't hear that here. He's gonna come after me now. Yeah, right. Like he's listening to this. Maybe it is. Anyway, let's get back to the seminar.
Yeah.
What do we want to talk about?
I like when he gets into what is this page 139 where he talks about what is it, at this level, like what does the notion of resistance signify and where can it be located in the schema? I think this is where we do, if I'm not mistaken, when he's mentioning resistance, we're still talking about like not resistance of the analytic session or like on the patient I wanted to speak, but more on like what censorship, correct?
Resistance is anything that interferes with the work of analysis,
right?
But censorship is a psychic reality. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, or I was just
censorship. Yeah,
I understand that distinction.
I just was still confused on it because we kind of clarified that like we call it censorship, and he says, like I think on the last one, it's like there is a resistance to censorship, but we shouldn't confuse it to the sort of resistance that was talked about in the other seminar and what we're used to seeing about like, anything that impedes the analytic treatment.
Well, Becker talks about this, how if a thought pops in your head, but you don't say it out of embarrassment or while reassociating, that's not censorship.
No, that's not.
But it would be resistance, right?
It would be,
yeah.
Yeah, because censorship isn't something that's sort of conscious. It's something that happens as sort of, I guess, unconscious, but on the level of that, like the sort of automatic response of dealing with excitation of some sort, it seems like. But yeah, it has nothing to do with like, oh, I don't want to share this embarrassing moment, or like, oh, like even I feel like embarrassed to talk to my analyst about my sexual life or something like that. That's not censorship.
Or even if you have a cringe memory and you avoid it or you try to distract yourself, that isn't censorship either.
Mm-hmm.
That's just distracting yourself from the unpleasant memory. This might be a shorter episode.
I mean, the chapter was not that long, but
let's talk about this is the mystical writing pad, right? Mystic writing pad. This is dope. Yeah. Why Theory has an episode that I haven't listened to yet, but I really want to, about the mystic writing pad. This metaphor of slate board, special properties of adhesivity. You draw on the transparent paper. The paper adheres to the slate underneath. The tracing appears on the surface of the paper, right? But then when you remove the paper, it disappears from the paper, but it remains on the slate, right? And the slate is the unconscious.
Exactly, yeah.
because the unconscious never forgets, right?
No.
It forgives, but it never forgets.
It never forgets.
It's like whatever the unconscious takes in, it preserves for eternity, which is a pretty terrifying thought. But so then what is the paper? Is that perception? Is that consciousness?
Yeah, I want to say it might be on the level of some type of like conscious or yeah, waking process. But yeah, that's definitely, it's definitely a good little analogy or whatever you want to call it that Freud develops.
It's like when the surface becomes virgin surface, Chad Slate.
Right. Yeah. That's a meme right there. That's a meme. It went over my head, like, why didn't I even think of that? But that's funny.
Virgin surface, Chad Slate, hunched over surface, like forgets everything, can't cope with the excitations that it's being fed. The slate preserves everything, is immortal, doesn't know time is atemporal.
Yeah. That's so good.
Yeah.
I mean, other than that, what else should we kind of
go over? Do we want to talk a little bit about their back and forth?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. With Vala Brega and Lacan again, because then, the notion of like what he's really getting at, like on 141, right? Like a lot of these difficulties with the certain schema of, I guess, because what we understand so far is like on the level of stimulation and excitation, but what does this stuff amount to in the level of the unconscious and kind of, I guess, building up towards Freud's theory of the unconscious, dreams, etc. And that, I think what I kind of iterated earlier is that, like, because this chapter is about regression is like this moving backwards of a sort of stimuli. It's like, well, if our sense of what we should get stimulus from or pleasure or so on should be like from what we're doing right now. Like I should get pleasure from, eating, not that it's even instinctual, but like, what's pleasurable is eating a burger, right? Drinking a beer. What's instinctual is the fact that I need to eat when my stomach growls and I need to drink water when I'm parched. And then what is also pleasurable is writing and, I don't know, like going to see a movie, right? These are instances of discharging excitation of the fact I'm building up so many thoughts and feelings because I'm bored and I have nothing to do, right? But why is it that there is this sort of split in that and in the dream in which there is constantly trying to fulfill excitation in this backward process when we think about how, because you mentioned about the preconscious of the ego. Well, if we look at the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious, right, there should be this sort of moving forward, right, in a set direction. But then there's this moving backwards.
I'm not sure I get it. What's moving backwards?
The need to discharge excitation. Why is it moving backwards in the form of the dream, in where the unconscious is manifesting itself or taking itself into account, rather than on the level of the waking life when we're living in the world, right? So we should be able to discharge all our excitation to that. It's going into discharging excitation backwards because it's building off of different memories, is what I'm trying to say.
I still don't really get why, because the dream is, for us, a secondary reality to waking life. essentially.
the thing is, it's like the dream is making up for that excess that it didn't account for, right? All these
It's a
excess
dream
memories.
backwards. Why does the dream take a
Because
back seat here to?
because it has to deal with, in a sense, the way I'm understanding it is has to deal with getting lost in time, getting lost into the history of the subject, right?
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Okay, I get it.
yeah,
You're born back
yeah.
against the
And
wave,
that's
whatever
why
the
it has
last
to,
line of Fitzgerald is there, but
right,
into your past. So that's why it's regressive, because you might have that, like Freud was talking about, 30-year-old humiliating memory that only pops up in the dream. That would appear
right.
regressive.
Yeah, and it's not to say that it can't like happen in your waking life, but it's like, why is there this sort of cathexis of doing it in the dream?
But you have, let's say, cringe moments you recall while you're awake, but you have an entire collection of those. It's like you know what they are, but then in the dream, one that you might have forgotten
Right, right.
comes back.
Exactly. Like, and that's the main thing, is that in the dream, there's this sort of investment into it and creating a sort of like form and structure and latent content, and scenario of how the wish fulfillment takes place. Because you can have a cringe moment in your waking day life, but there's no investment into it. It's actually a rejection, like, oh, like you react to it in like in an ugly way. Like, but let's say you have that cringe moment take place in a certain scenario in your dream, you're actively, well, I wouldn't say active, but like the dream self, for lack of a better term, the dream person is invested and absorbed in that sort of life.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Can we talk about this paragraph here? Because I think it's really interesting. I think what we have here is a kind of Easter egg that Lacan offers us, even if it wasn't his intention to do so, that might help us understand how to read Lacan better and unlock some of the difficulties of
Right.
his supposed unintelligible style. But it's funny. He seems genuinely irritated by Vala Brega here. Um, and he's like, I can see that for today, the attention you're willing to give to quite straightforward things is somewhat wavering. We are confronted
Right.
by this singular contradiction. I don't know if it should be called dialectical, that the less you understand, the better you listen. For I often say very difficult things to you, and I see you hanging on every word, and I learn later that some of you didn't understand. On the other hand, when you're told things that are very simple, that are almost too well known, you're less attentive. I say that in passing. Like any concrete observation, it has its merits. I deliver it up to you, to your reflection. Very passive aggressive.
It's funny because he really does like speak like that, where it's like, he's saying something that's like very simple and it goes over your head. It's just like, when he just says something too complex, because it seems like that's like, oh, what you want to hear. Then you have something ready to say, but it's like when he gave you a cut dry answer, it's just like, oh, no response.
Exactly, because he has this very tortured kind of syntax that he, I think, deliberately pursues. And in his writing, it's over the top.
Yeah.
Forget it. It's like so extreme. But
It's
even
worse than
here,
reading Kant. It's worse than reading Kant.
it's worse than reading anybody.
Yeah.
I would say,
It's,
but
no,
even
Kant is really bad at like doing that shit too. But like he's just so like,
yeah, Kant's a nasty motherfucker. But here it's like the seminars, I enjoy reading them, but the way he unpacks an idea, it's like I feel like he deliberately says certain things in a way where you have to circle around the sentence because there are just so many clauses and like weird connectives that don't seem to make sense. And you know, my first instinct would be to say like there's a simpler way to say this. And of course, when it comes to um writing 101, when you're revising your writing, everyone will say, get rid of all of these unnecessary words, condense, be more economical with your language. But Lacan doesn't seem to have gotten that memo, but it's part of his style. And then what he does, though, is he'll shock you by punctuating his statements with a very simple remark that will remain in your mind forever, like the real is that which resists symbolization absolutely. That's a simple enough statement, but those are few and far between. So you have to earn those. But doesn't he say in Seminar 1 in the preface that that's the Zen style? Like, what is it? Like, basically, the Zen master will intervene at just the moment
when you're on the verge
of a realization, an epiphany of some kind. And
because that epiphany, like that you think it's like, oh, I got it. It's no, you didn't. Let me intervene. Come back tomorrow.
yeah. It's like you're not allowed to climax. You're prevented from this braingasm that
exactly
you think is gonna solve everything.
Self-help is masturbation, and that's psychoanalysis is not in the business of that.
No, you're allowed to not enjoy.
Exactly.
I don't know. Maybe that does it. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, with all the jargon on here, I think the main thing that is at the problem of regression is the fact of or the difficulties of it, not the problem, because it's difficult in the fact of like, I think what Lacan is getting at in conjunction with understanding in the seminar Beyond the Pleasure Principle is that the paradox shows that yes, in the waking life that we seek pleasure and we want to sort of not relinquish, but like minimize excitation, right? This is what Freud's been dealing with his schema and also understanding reality and pleasure principle. But it doesn't always get pleasure, so therefore it does it in regression in the dream life. But even then, it's like, well, who's the wish fulfillment for, right? And that was why the question of the subject. Also, you mentioned something in the beginning of the chapter of like, there is a sort of confusion in which both the ego and even the subject kind of seem to be parallel, because both seem to be trying to get a sort of sense of wish fulfillment, even though it's never attained. And I think what this sets the groundwork for is understanding the notion of repetition and undermining and the compulsion to repeat, and the overall death, and why like Lacan will always stress, like it's always been in Freud since day one. He just, when he switches his transition from scientific writing to the dream work, to theories of sexuality completed by narcissism, like his whole play of writings, to the final work that makes Freud who he is, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, that this sort of structure was always there. It's always sublating, and it finally makes its fruition in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. This undermining comes about. And I really like what Todd McGowan says in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle episode in Why Theory, that if we read Death Drive and Beyond the Pleasure Principle within that work, Interpretation of Dreams, it starts to make more sense if we put privilege and nightmare over just the normal dream. Like even that beginning dream that Freud talks about in chapter 7 is almost like a nightmare, right? Because what's being encountered is the real for Lacan, and why he wants to go back to that dream or that chapter in Seminar 11, but focus on that dream specifically. Because there's an encounter not only with desire, but even the real itself in that. Almost like with Freud going over like Irma's injection and wanting to place the blame and responsibility onto his colleague for giving her the injection, not Freud himself, right? Well, that's what's being encountered, in my opinion. But like pretty much what I'm trying to say is that this is what is trying to be worked through. It's like at these early writings up till now, like we see these sort of like splits and paradoxes and dilemmas that's like no matter what, the subject never seems to be constituted holistically or like gain sort of instantiation or privilege because of something new. First it was like, oh shit, you know, there's a reality principle, there's a pleasure principle, and it seems to be balancing off the two. Oh shit, now we got a freaking unconscious that dreams and therefore the ego is not responsible. Oh shit, now we got narcissism, and even narcissism is a problem. We can't get that. Oh fuck, now we got a death drive, and now you know what are we gonna do? We just can't get a break.
Right. The discenterment is complete.
Yeah.
In the death drive, and now we truly are not the masters within our own house at that point. I think I get it. I think the next few chapters will open it back up because I feel like there's some regressive digressions going on in this chapter that make it feel a little wonky.
Yeah, and that's like what Lacan is literally building up and why he wants to go back to these writings in the show. Like, yo, it's already in there. It's just a different form that, like, literally the decentrament of the ego in different ways. Like, the build up to the death drive is the ultimate decentrament of just the organism in general. But like how like the privileging of ego and why like these like other schools of psychoanalysis are getting it wrong because they don't want to go back to Freud and realize the sort of form. They're just like, oh, Freud is just, you know, crude scientific, crude biologist. Oh, he doesn't understand, you know, anything about, you know, this and that, or just disregarding libido, disregarding like the not privilege, the like the importance of recognizing the problem of sexuality, right? And these sort of antinomies or contradictions in there. Like, and that's why like even like I think you said it before, it's like Lacan was a bad reader of Hegel because he was a Kojevian, but at the same time, when he's, you know, doing his work and he's actually doing the dialectical method and giving it justice, right? And seeing where these deadlocks are in the theoretical notions and sort of sublating them. And seeing how this thread of thought takes place in another work. That's the whole point of the play of writings, it seems like.
I think that just about does it.
Mm-hmm.
Our shortest episode yet.
Yeah, and the last thing to say is that the ego is the psi system. That's it. That's just what he was trying to build up to show that like how the ego plays on it. And like I just think it's like a very redundant. Like this couple chapters are pretty hard, but it's also in a way sort of redundant when you start to understand it more.
The psi system. Vala Brega thought it was something. The psi was something other than the ego.
Right. So at first he thought it was like, well, he wanted to say that the psi system was in charge of excitation or something like that, but he didn't really give justice to the omega. And that's what Lacan was saying in the prior chapter. It's like, no, things are happening in the omega, right? On the level of perception in the way that, you know, understanding resistance and even censorship, but that the ego does constitute all of psi, because there are parts of the ego that are not conscious, but I wouldn't say are completely unconscious. Maybe we could use the term preconscious, but parts of the pathogenic nucleus that you aren't aware of, and how Freud stumbled upon that through hypnosis.
We can see that in the optical schema, right?
Yes.
Before we even get to the plane mirror with the concave mirror.
Yes.
There are parts of, I guess, the bouquet that you can't see because the ego is not consciousness in that sense.
Yeah.
Actually, I think just had a little epiphany in that you would think, oh, well, the ego is very conscious. That is what lies on the surface of our experience of reality. That's my ego experiencing things. But like you said, the pathogenic nucleus has all of these blind spots, is made up of these blind spots. And what happens in analysis is that the closer you get to
absolutely,
ego, the more you experience it as something that is soluble.
Yes.
Is coming apart, because what keeps it together is it's interlacing that holds it together is unconscious.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't you say?
Yes, absolutely.
That's all, folks. That's all I got. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Happy Kwanzaa. As Krusty the Clown says, have a tip-top tet for our Vietnamese friends. And we love you all.
Yeah.
Bye.
That was a
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, as Trump said.
Bye.
Bye-bye.